All right, welcome everyone to today's webinar. We are going to welcome Dr. Jane Thurfeld Brown. She's the director of the college autism spectrum. She's a former assistant clinical professor at Yale Child Study and Yale Medical School and a retired director of student services at the University of Connecticut School of Law. Dr. Brown has worked in disability services for 43 years, and she holds an EDD from Columbia University Teachers College. She consults with many families, students, and school districts and institutions of higher ed. Dr. Brown has appeared on Good Morning America, CBS News, and NPR, and she has co-authored books including Students with Asperger's, A Guide for College Professionals, The Parent's Guide to College for Students on the Autism Spectrum, and Behavior Management and Self-Regulation, along with many other publications like textbook chapters and articles. And she comes to us both with this impressive and extensive professional resume, as well as personal experience as the mother of a son with autism. And with that, we'll get started. Welcome, Dr. Brown.
Thank you so much, Stacy, and I'm honored to be with you all today. Thank you for having me. We're going to talk about autism and neurodiversity today, and I'm going to talk mainly about students in the classroom or on your college campus. So I want to first talk about language, because for many years, those of us in a disability profession worked very hard with politicians and journalists and college personnel and teachers getting people to understand that we needed person-first language. It was a student with a learning disability, a person who was blind, or a person in a wheelchair. Things have changed quite a bit. And now there are many different groups that really prefer or desire us to use language of identity first, like the blind student, the autistic person. Still others prefer a different term, neurodiversity, or the singular neurodivergent. And what I've found in my work is everyone has a different opinion on how they like to be referred to. And I really encourage you to ask. We have students, staff, and faculty alike on our campuses that are neurodiverse and autistic. And many people prefer being a student with autism, or an autistic student, or a neurodiverse student, or as many students say to me, can't I just be Brian? Can't I just be Bob? Can't I just be Sue? And they can't. It's just a matter of us being able to ask first what people prefer. As far as neurodiversity, because that is a term getting thrown around a lot on college campuses, so I want to just bring up some information about it from the untapped group. Neurodiversity is a way of thinking about neurological conditions such as autism, attention deficit, dyslexia, and I will add learning disabilities and psychiatric disabilities as variations from the typical population rather than a disability. Advocates for neurodiversity reject the idea that it's a problem to be fixed, but rather that we're all neurologically diverse in some way. Implementing various workplace accommodations, flexibility in the way we interact with others, and acceptance of neurodiversity as a way of life would allow a meaningful percentage of the neurodiverse population to become valuable members of our working community, and I would add, and our campus communities. So language really projects our attitudes, and it's very important that we use appropriate language. So imagine, if you will, that wherever you're sitting, if you're in an on-campus office, if you're in a home office, as I am today, or if you're with a group listening in a larger room, but the chair that you're sitting in, whether it's fabric or plastic or leather, but you're probably not thinking about how that material feels against your clothing or against your skin, or the flooring and how it feels against the soles of your shoes or the soles of your feet. If you're lucky enough to have windows, you're probably not thinking about how the sun is coming in and what it might be shining off of. If you have overhead lights, you may or may not be bothered by the overhead lighting and the way it comes either off your computer or into your eyes. But what if you couldn't screen out all that sensory information? and that you really didn't understand how other people just went about their day without seeming to be bothered by all that sensory bombardment, and that they're expecting you to do the same. And what if you just couldn't? This is a quote from a very bright engineering student who allows me to use his words. It's as if the sun is too loud. It's as if everything I can see has a corresponding auditory of high notes and crashes, makes it difficult to concentrate, even to walk upright. It feels like everyone is talking at once, and you don't know who to listen to. This student was very, very symptomatic in sensory overload, and just getting through day to day and class to class and walking through campus was really a challenge. Carla Fisher, a brilliant researcher who herself is autistic, explains this as brain drain. And she teaches us that about 80% of information coming into a neurotypical brain is processed subconsciously. We don't really think a lot about it. You may not be thinking about the noise that your computer is making, or the noise or the cars that you hear outside, or any of the paper that's distracting you, or thinking about your next appointment. You can pretty much let that information flow through your brain. But because of different connections in the brain and different and sometimes delayed processing, the autistic brain processes most information at a totally conscious level, and it's exhausting. And a typical day requires a lot of energy, and often people just get overwhelmed. This slide is with permission from a friend and colleague, Sarah Gardner, from Bellevue College in Bellevue, Washington. And here she quotes Alexander Den Heyer: "When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower." For many years, and I've been in higher ed, as was mentioned, for many decades, but for years we talked about, is this student really prepared for college? Is the high school doing a good enough job? Are they really preparing students for this next level? And when we think about today's student, and we think about the pandemic and how that affected all of us, we really need to look at, is the college prepared for today's student? It's really a different way of thinking, but we have to really wonder if we're ready for the very different learners that are coming to our campus. And again, we don't want to fix the flower, we fix the environment. At its very base, autism is a communication disability. And that means there's difficulties processing some incoming information. Often reading between the lines can be very difficult to determine what you mean that's implicit and what's explicit. Many students will ask too many questions, trying to get a lot of this communication settled in their mind. But we have to always remember, you won't see a lot of behaviors from students on a college campus, from autistic students. But when you do, behavior is always communication. So we really sometimes have to think about what the student is trying to communicate. Some of the challenges for many students with autism is that nonverbal communication, that sometimes we say things without using our voice. When you push your chair away from your desk and you stand up, or you even reach for the door, maybe that is really saying non-verbally, our meeting is over, it's time to leave. But if people don't pick up on that nonverbal communication, what do we do? Sometimes it causes difficulty interacting with peers, but frequently it doesn't always cause difficulty interacting one-to-one with an adult. But possibly because of the power relationship with faculty, there may be some difficulty in negotiating with faculty. We have a lot of students who really struggle to communicate and get their needs met, but a lot more students are really isolated and are not making or initiating those connections to other people, both faculty and peers and staff. So we're always concerned about students staying safe. And that's both online and in person. So we know that communication is a big part of working with autistic students. This is from a student who came to a talk I did a few years ago and asked if he could email me afterwards. Your emphasis on the nature of autism as a communication disability was commendable. The innumerable subtleties, the nuances of even a two-person interaction feel unnatural and indeed uncomfortable. Sometimes they vex me to no end. Although social skills training has imbued me with the ability to detect these subtleties and integrate them into my own communication style, I still make errors of varying degree and afterwards ruminate on said errors out of fear that I have been awkward beyond salvation. Just how alien these conventions are to autistics is not that well known or well understood among neurotypicals, even among some who are, quote, aware of autism, unquote. I must thank you for taking time to address this. The student contacted me about difficulties they were having in writing. I wrote back saying, I'm struggling to understand your difficulty in writing, as this is probably the most well-worded email I've ever received from a student or a faculty member. And what the student explained was this type of writing they could do. But when it came to being given an assignment to compare these two characters from history, or to write in the voice of a different character, that they couldn't do, as long as their brain was responsible for communicating something they were thinking. They could write this beautifully. Important to remember when we're working with students. So autism is also an interpersonal challenge with some people because of those core social skills. And as our previous student said, they've been taught, many students have been taught those social skills. It's implementing them. So continuing that social skills training often does not help. For some students, they haven't had a lot of social opportunity prior to coming to our campuses, so that lack of social awareness or naivete. So often our students might appear awkward, or it might seem an effort to be able to initiate conversation. There was a wonderful article by Tanguay many years ago that called this intuitive social knowledge, that we just know what to do when we see colleagues or students, that we know what we might want to say or business we might want to quickly conduct, but we do it in a way that's socially accepted. And sometimes students don't always look that way. The other issue for many of our students, again, because without a lot of social experience, many students do become bully magnets. And I've yet to be on a campus anywhere in the country where I've met with students. And I always say, have you experienced bullying? And I've yet to hear the students say no. A lot of autistic students are frequently bullied throughout their education. So let's talk numbers just a bit. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention did a study in 2020 that was reported in 2023, just this past March. And the prevalence for autism among 8-year-olds is 1 in 36. 1 in 36. I'm sorry, that number is reversed here. It's not 3.5 million, my mistake. It's 5.3 million Americans. And we know it's the fastest growing developmental disability and has been for a long time. A lot of the students you're working with on campus at NDSU were born somewhere between 2000 and maybe 2004, depending on their age, or 2005, the first year students. And they are coming from 1 in 50 to 1 in 25. Over the next 10 years, remember the current reported study was done in 2020, and the 8-year-olds, the prevalence is 1 in 36. we're going to see a tremendous increase over the next 10 years. And just to show you a further increase, when I was trained, which was the late 70s and early 80s, we were trained. I was researching autism long before my kids were born and before my son was diagnosed. So the late 70s and early 80s, we were told 1 in 10,000 children are diagnosed with autism. They didn't even talk about adults. So 1 in 10,000. And in 1995, when my son was diagnosed at age 3, I was told it was 1 in 1,000. And I was shocked that it had gone in that time from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 1,000. Imagine the difference now in that, from 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 36. My son is 31 years old, and in the 28 years since he was diagnosed, that's how prevalent autism has become. So let's talk just briefly about some laws you need to know. I'm not an attorney. I worked at a law school for 20 odd years as their director of student services, but my doctorate is in education and psychology. Just briefly, kindergarten through 12th grade, your students are under, or actually kindergarten through the high school diploma, whether they get it after senior year or they stay till 21. Students are under IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This is a federal law of educational entitlement, which guarantees something called FAPE, a free and appropriate public education. The parents and the school are responsible, and success is ensured, meaning that the student cannot fail out of special education. The program has to fit the child. And because of that, courses can be modified, grades can be modified, things like homework, everybody do problems 1 through 25, but you student, you get to just do the odd numbers or the even numbers, those kinds of modifications. It's based on evaluation, remediation, and the special accommodations, like I mentioned, in one of the 13 federal categories as a diagnostic label. The students then receive their diploma and move on to the adult world of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Amendments Act, which includes college. This is no longer federal law of entitlement. This is civil rights statute of eligibility. And now the parent and the school are no longer responsible. It's the student who's responsible. And in higher ed, we can't guarantee success for anyone who pays tuition for our courses. What we do guarantee is equal access to programs and services based on reasonable accommodation in level of functional impairment in a major life activity. These are drastically different laws, but most students and their families don't know about this difference. So many are looking for special education in college, and we can't do that. In kindergarten through graduation, the program must fit the child. In the adult world, the student has to fit the program. So this can be difficult because some students are going to be asking faculty and staff to accommodate in ways that they knew in high school. But often by law, we cannot do that. What we provide are reasonable accommodations to a qualified person with a disability in order for them to have an equal opportunity to participate. And so what does otherwise qualified means? It means you're able to attend class and complete required work. You're able to maintain appropriate behavioral standards, so conduct codes must be enforced. And you're able to advocate for yourself with minimal assistance. And that's all directly from the law, from the ADA. So what we often talk about in college are fundamental requirements of programs, because those are the pieces that are essential to your programs of instruction. And accommodations that are made through disability services or accessibility services should never fundamentally alter those programs. So let's talk courses now and what faculty may need some ideas for in the classroom. Your courses demand all of these things. I won't read the entire list, but this is a pretty general list of what higher education is about, using logic and abstract skills, and we hope at some point generating alternate solutions. And you absolutely do not have to compromise on those expectations. So let's talk about some of the problems that autistic students report. Let's talk about coursework in general. Some of our students get really overwhelmed, and a lot of that's because of time management and organization. Some of it's the multitasking. Many of us who stay in higher ed, both staff and faculty, we really like multitasking. We like not doing the exact same thing all day long, and so we like the higher ed environment because we get to do different things. That can be a problem for some students with autism. Sometimes initiation and follow through are really difficult. I may have started the homework, but I didn't get to finish it and hand it in. Sometimes it's just managing those deadlines or multiple deadlines. So what do? Hopefully we have a very clear syllabus, and any changes in syllabi, please put on your portal, saying to students, well, we kind of went longer in those chapters than I expected, so just take everything in the syllabus and move it back a week. That is overwhelming to students who struggle with executive function. So just changing those dates on your portal syllabus can really make a difference. Sometimes we have to have individual meetings with students who aren't handing things in or just can't seem to get any of the assignments in. And for long-term assignments, interim deadlines really help. If you've got a paper due in 6 weeks or a project, in 2 weeks, give me your topic. In 4 weeks, give me your draft. And in 6 weeks, you hand in the final paper or project. But some of our students really need to use the plethora of services that are on your campus. You have lots of academic support and tutoring, and you have different departmental tutors. Make sure you not only refer for this strategy tutoring. That was not a Freudian slip. Make sure you refer for strategy tutoring, but make sure the student's going. Really important if you can check. A lot of this is really universal design, which is just an educational approach that meets the needs of diverse students, but it really helps all your students. So some general universal design tips. We talked about the syllabus and the changes. If you can give progress reports, it helps the student tremendously. Sometimes I'm working with students in mid-semester, they have no grades on their homeworks or anything, and that's really difficult for a student to understand if what they're doing right or wrong. Again, individual meetings if you can, and the interim deadlines, and of course, referral for support services. Some students really struggle with writing, and of course, this is not just our neurodiverse students. There's many students who struggle. And a lot of faculty report that it's writing synthetically or stating the obvious. Understanding plots and character motivation can be a real struggle for students, along with the compare and contrast kinds of papers. That can really, people are thinking about the compare and contrast and not the actual subject you're teaching. The long-term assignments, as we said, but the personal perspectives, some students are great at writing, as you saw in a previous slide, at their own personal perspective. Some really struggle with that self-awareness. And some students really excel at writing, though. So the same goes true for essay exams. So if you can, if you see that in class a student is talking and they seem to have a much better understanding of the material than they're showing you on an exam, sometimes a supplement, if it's appropriate. Alternatives to some assignments, if it's not fundamental to your course, like compare and contrast. I always remember an email I got from a mom explaining to me that for her son, a cloud is always a cloud to Kevin. It doesn't show impending doom. It doesn't show it's about to rain. It's a cloud. This is not the kind of work he can complete. Oral versus written projects. If it doesn't matter if the project is written or oral, or a PowerPoint, something like that can really be helpful. Most faculty allow computers for exams if appropriate, and that can help tremendously. And what helps even more is voice input software. Going from the brain to the mouth is a totally different part of the brain than going from the brain to the fingers. And we think in writing with our hands very differently than we speak. And for a lot of students and for a lot of faculty, voice input for a first draft can make all the difference. Get the ideas down and then clean up the language so it's more like writing than speaking. And sometimes we really struggle to get students to try that and do it, but it's really worth it. We talked about essay questions, and for exams, a lot of the difficulty is following instructions and processing speed. Students will report that the directions are given orally at the beginning, and they were said so fast I couldn't keep up. And also I was so anxious about the exam that I lost the professor in the first couple words, and then I didn't know what I was doing. So sometimes it's that processing speed. And if the student is taking an exam with extended time or a distraction reduced environment, they may not get the opportunity to hear those verbal instructions. So managing distractions, sensory issues, and for some, it's just being too close to other anxious people. You know how it feels walking into that room full of anxious students about to take an exam. So some students need breaks or less distraction or really more time to take those breaks. That's why they may be taking them in a testing center or with an accommodated exam. Sometimes computers, and I'm sure most of you don't want handwritten exams anymore. If any of you are still using bubble sheets, and there's often multiple choice exams with bubble sheets, some students actually can't use those. They'll always put in the wrong number. They can't transfer those numbers. So just circling the number on the exam, and either registrar or the testing center coordinator can fill in the bubble sheets. Sensory modifications, if necessary, if someone needs to bring food or other sensory items to an exam. And then sometimes if there's lots of exams close together, the student might need to have them spaced far apart, only if it's not fundamental to your class. If you have an essay exam, someone might need to give you oral supplements to that, but only if it would work for your curriculum. A lot of students have a very difficult time speaking publicly. That social anxiety is different. Language deficits, just organizing your thoughts or modulating your voice so that it doesn't sound just monotone and that you can keep people's interest. And sometimes what we all had to get used to from Zoom is losing the faces so you could read the audience and at least know, are people just multitasking? Are they bored? Am I putting them to sleep? You lose that with Zoom. And for some people, it's motor difficulties. Can I handle the tech while I'm getting feedback? And it can be difficult to manage all of that. So some solutions. Again, if you're teaching a public speaking class, then people have to speak publicly. That sometimes there's no reasonable accommodation. But there are some things, if it's other kinds of presentations, that we can do, like videotape, which is very easy now on the computer, or webcast a presentation with a PowerPoint. That's how most corporations or businesses do presentations, and it's a good learning tool. For some students, just presenting in person to a smaller group is easier than a 20 or 30 person class. If it's not fundamental, you can do an alternate assignment, but sometimes you just can't. What we found really helps if it's available in your area. And I didn't look if it was close in North Dakota, but just about every state has a Toastmasters group. And that's been a wonderful way for us to get students, any age college student, to really work on their public speaking skills. And a lot of the older people or more seasoned people in Toastmasters once had difficulty speaking in public, and they're a tremendous help to students. Group work can be very difficult for neurodiverse individuals. And I'm trying very hard as I work at high schools across the country to get people to take out of their accommodations no group work. So many students are coming to us in college having been exempt from group work in high school as an accommodation. And that really isn't helpful. There's not many jobs you can do nowadays that you don't have to work with other people. So some of the main problems, choosing partners can be very difficult. Dividing tasks. Sometimes those two pieces are the products of the student's demise. When you say to your class, okay, break yourself up into groups of 4. A lot of times the student with autism is not going to jump up and say, I want to be in your group, or maybe they will and the person rejects them or something, but that's a very social piece that might be difficult for a lot of students. And then there's the managing the conflict of dividing tasks, who's going to do what, managing the goals and the timelines. Sometimes it's just working in close proximity again to others. Group work is really social, and for a lot of students, that's a problem. And then it's either being bullied or being the bully. In other words, if a group says to a student, you know what, we got this, don't come to the meetings, we'll just put your name on the project, don't worry about it. Or the other way, the neurodiverse students saying, I don't want to work with all of you, I'm going to do the project, I'll put your names on it, please don't bother me. That's being the bully, and neither one works. So what do? If you can, select the groups in advance. Just a PowerPoint slide with last names can really help. If or any other way of choosing groups, but doing it in advance so that the autistic student isn't feeling left out. Assigning the tasks, if it's possible for the group work, dividing it into however many people are in the group, 3 or 4, dividing those tasks, that can help tremendously. But if the purpose of the project is having the group figure out the tasks, then they have to do that themselves. If you're lucky enough to have a teaching assistant, monitoring the group dynamics, making sure somebody isn't being left out or doing all the work, only if it's really applicable. And there's very few scenarios that I've seen this is applicable, that the student should work alone. Because really being allowed to just do independent projects that are supposed to be group work doesn't help the student at all. I want to stop for a minute. Stacy, are there questions that I'm ignoring at the moment?
I was wondering if we could ask about the incredible increase in the diagnoses of autism. And my questions are there truly that many more students with autism, or are we just diagnosing better, or is there a cause? Like, what are the causes for that are being hypothesized?
Yes to all of the above. We are doing better diagnosing. There truly are that many people. No one really knows the reason. There are some things being hypothesized, but what a lot of people talk about is that in previous generations, a lot of us had a relative that maybe acted different than the other adults, or that still lived with mom and dad and nobody asked why. And, maybe it was Uncle Charlie who had a train set in the basement, but the kids couldn't play with the train set, so you didn't bother Uncle Charlie's trains. And so, but Uncle Charlie years ago or generations ago didn't get a diagnosis. He was just someone who lived with the family. He didn't get married and have his own family. So some of it is that we just didn't diagnose. And a lot of the jobs that people did that really fit well into a more autistic profile no longer exist. A lot of people are very good with numbers or schedules or special interests. So we had a lot of people working for Amtrak or train systems, and they could give you the train schedule off the top of their head. We had a lot of people working in the post office, and I could go on and on with those jobs, but all of those became automated. So we didn't need those people working anymore. And now everybody was sitting home, and finding other jobs that worked for these very unique individuals is a very tough task. And so we found more and more people that were diagnosed because the community where they could fit no longer existed. So that's one of the reasons. There is one article that gave one reason of the increase, and that is advanced paternal age. So advanced age of the father shows an increase in autism, that they used as the beginning age 45. And I'm sure all of us know a lot of men now having children into their 40s. And so that doesn't account for many of these kids who are being born to young parents in their 20s and 30s. And that study was not terribly broad. So that's the only thing that they've found while having studied the air and the water and the food and the parents and everything. We've been involved in lots of studies, research studies as a family. And no one has found anything. There are two places in the country that they've found that have an increased prevalence: Orange County, California, and Bergen County, New Jersey. And their numbers have been 2 or 3 reporting years ahead of the rest of the country. And so those places, especially, everything has been studied, and they can't find the reason. So hypothetically, there are many researchers that are saying these are brain changes, and that it's evolutionary changes in the brain that are making us being able to identify more autistic young people. However, there's also a lot of adults being diagnosed, and I'm sure you've all met people who are diagnosed, and especially women, because for a long time it was believed that autism was a mostly male diagnosis. And of course now that's changed drastically, where we think we'll get closer eventually to a 60-40 male to female split. But for years, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, people were saying it was 85% male and 15% female. So especially women who were good academically and were not behavioral problems, they were not getting diagnosed. Many were eventually diagnosed in college or in their adult life, and many still go undiagnosed today. So I don't have a good answer for you, Stacy. We really don't know. There are certainly states that have many more people with autism, or especially children, in the education system, and people tend to flock to places that have good special education systems.
So a
So
follow-up on that, one of the participants asked, is it true that more faculty kids turn out to be autistic than other groups, if you know, as a group, if we have higher numbers?
It depends who you ask. There was one study done by Simon Baron-Cohen, who's a very brilliant, very well-known researcher in autism. He's a professor in England. He was asked to do a study at MIT because they had an alumni gathering of engineering students, and they had people from all different years, and a lot of the people who had kids were talking about their kids being diagnosed as autistic. Excuse me. And so the college had Simon Baron-Cohen do a study of all of these folks, looking at whether these specific, if engineering faculty were more likely to have autistic kids. I think you would find some people who would say yes, and some people would say absolutely not. There's just as many people in every other profession. So it depends. We certainly have a lot of faculty with autism, many of whom were never diagnosed, many who have been diagnosed. And I'm always encouraging faculty to disclose on campus. That would be so helpful. But I haven't seen anything that quantifies in a jury journal, any articles or research that have said faculty are more likely to have autistic kids. Okay, so I'll move on. Let's talk about behavior, and hopefully you're not going to see aberrant behavior from any of your students, but a very small percentage of neurodiverse students may have some issues in class. Sometimes it's interrupting you or calling out or correcting you. Sometimes students are out of their seat or pacing in the back of the class. For some, it's just sensory things in the classroom are really disturbing. There are a small number of students who do have mannerisms or make what we call them vocalizations. One of the issues about class behavior, and it's still a behavioral issue, is classmates' attitudes or their reaction to the student. And we hope it doesn't happen, but occasionally we'll have a student who might have an outburst or what we call a meltdown. And so what do? We know a lot of this is from anxiety. So I know most of you probably don't cold call in class. In other words, you're asking for volunteers rather than just picking on a student to speak. And because the cold calling does create a lot of anxiety. For some students, they really need to bring some sensory objects to class, and for some, that's food or drink. Some students will need breaks. I know a lot of students are asked, even though in high school they may be allowed to pace in the back of the class, that's really disruptive to a lot of students and to most faculty members when somebody's pacing in the back of the class. So we try and ask students to take a break if they need it. And because they might be out of the class and taking a break, we usually ask for a note taker to have that class taped. So whatever the student's missing, they can catch up on. And sometimes the students need a laptop to take notes. I know a lot of faculty nowadays will ban laptops from the classroom because too many students are playing video games or watching movies. But some students, as an accommodation, may need the laptop, but you do have to, especially if students are interrupting a lot, you may need to put some rules for class discussion. If a student seems to have a lot to say, but isn't letting anyone else speak. So either telling students that everyone in class has to talk before someone talks again. Sometimes a talking stick or time limits can help so the student isn't taking over the class. Sometimes just a nonverbal refocus. So if some faculty will talk to the student and say, if I tap my cheek with my index finger, I'm telling you either you're talking too long or you're off topic. And that way I won't have to say it to the class. So just watch for this. For some students that won't work with the nonverbal, but for some it will. And sometimes telling people ahead of time what you expect for participation and what you expect not to happen, so that you expect students not to be talking most of the class, but that you want them to add to the discussion. Sometimes if a student can't put their hand down, saying, I'm going to call on you, it's going to be a couple minutes, I'm going to finish this part of the lecture. What's worked really well as far as, and what I mean by points docked for poor citizenship. So what we've turned to in some classes is suggesting to faculty that they have what we call just a civility bonus points. And if they are in class and they're good citizens of the class, they're allowing everyone to speak. They're learning from other people's viewpoints rather than just rolling their eyes or, crossing their arms or making sounds of disgust because somebody has a different viewpoint. And we want our classrooms to be safe spaces. So in doing that and saying, if you're civil in class and you follow the discussion rules, you get a half point per class. And that can add to bonus points for the end of the semester. Students don't want to lose those points. And hopefully we're teaching some civility and getting them to listen to other people who may disagree with them or may be different than they are. We like people who are the same. On your campuses, musicians hang out with musicians, athletes hang out with athletes, faculty hang out with faculty, and so on, and staff hang out with staff. So if a student's a little different, how do they get accepted? Being able to teach that this is how you be civil. And with the numbers, for the students we're teaching today, people with autism are going to be their next door neighbors, the parents of their kids' friends, their coworkers. We really need to help them understand how to interact with people who are different. Some visual cues may help, but what we know is that most autistic students are much more visual learners than auditory learners. So what really helps is putting things in writing or having a common visual. So not demanding eye contact by sitting across a desk from someone, because that really says you're looking to make eye contact with the person. And for a lot of autistic individuals, eye contact causes anxiety, and they may not get a lot of information from faces. So by sitting next to the person, social distancing if needed, and having a common visual to look at, it can really help the meeting. Giving even a short 15, 20-minute meeting some structure. Come in, sit down. We're going to talk about your recent assignment. We're going to talk about the next exam, and then we'll talk about pre-registration for your next classes. You've now given the student a way to know what to expect is about to happen. And that can help tremendously. And if you can just write those 3 things down, helps even more. What I frequently use to make students comfortable is a whiteboard. And then I don't have to be looking at them. If they're uncomfortable with eye contact, don't feel like they have to make eye contact. And when I finish writing, I have them take a picture with their phone. Now I know they're taking the information with them and they have responsibility for it. If they ask me to email them the information, now it's my responsibility. If I write it on a piece of paper, chances are that will get lost. So using that whiteboard sort of changes the dynamic and it puts it more of a teaching moment, but it gives you the opportunity that you don't have to give the student the idea that if they're not making eye contact, they're not meeting with you correctly. So one of the things we really need to do is create really clear behavioral requirements. Our conduct codes on campuses were written by lawyers for lawyers. And so changing that into just some really understandable standards makes a huge difference, not only for the student, but the family too, because they need to understand that this is very different from high school, because our standards are not subject to accommodation. Our processes are. So we don't change the standards because students really need to understand the rules and the consequences for breaking them. This might be really different for students with autism because many students will not recognize their behavior as inappropriate. They may just see it as who they are. The number one complaint against autistic students at colleges is stalking. Often the student does not understand why they've been accused of stalking, but often their behavior while they're trying to join a group or trying to talk to someone or trying to make a friend is interpreted as stalking. For some students, again, they may be easily manipulated by others. And we really don't have rules to give people for dating or parties. Or as a student asked me about a month ago, can you please help me learn how to hang out? I know the other students are hanging out and I don't know how to. It's difficult to explain when everybody's saying to each other, yeah, you want to hang out after class? Yeah, okay, I'll meet you there. How do you explain to students what you do when you hang out? We know that even though there's these challenges and differences, that disability never excuses behavior. So we need to make sure that students really understand the rules, but also that we tell them how to behave appropriately and assist them with places on campus where they may calm down if they need to. A lot of campuses now are setting up sensory rooms that help everybody and giving giving the opportunity for lots of students that understand, not only because we have a lot of students with autism on our campuses, but for every student with autism, there's 1, 2, 3, or even more siblings. So that many people on campus are watching how that student with autism is received and then thinking, that could be my brother or sister. I can't believe they have to go through this just to go to college. They have, and yet we don't attend to what that does in a classroom or on a campus to the siblings of those folks. So if a student does have a meltdown, and we hope they don't, but if they do, you want to be very concrete and specific, offer a quiet place to calm down. Don't argue with or touch the student. Students will tell me that if they're in that state, that physical touch actually causes pain. So we want to speak quietly and calmly. That's not a time we want to use a lot of language. We want to just use a few words. We want to get the person, if they're in a class, we want to get them away from the rest of the class. If it happens continuously, you certainly want to contact a point person on campus, and they may need to contact a family member if appropriate. But again, we hope that doesn't happen, but I would be remiss not talking about it. So a lot of what we've talked about today is really about the college degree. But really, for our students, it's not just the college degree that's the goal. It's becoming independent, successful adults, and hopefully using that college education for a career and a job and being part of a community. And that's really our goal for everyone, for autistic and neurotypical students alike. We just want the same opportunity for both those groups. So these are our books, which I'll show you quickly. And I'm going to leave my contact info because I'm hoping to answer some questions. But if I can't, I really hope to be able to. Wait, let me go back to my screen share so I can leave my contact info up. I really hope to be able to answer some questions on email if we need to.
There is a question in the chat.
Oh, it's autism behavior usually getting worse during teenage phase. Some patients grow out of it, some get worse. Absolutely. Puberty can make many people with autism go through the same thing most people go through in puberty, but some can be exaggerated with some students with autism. It depends what we're talking about and what behavior's getting worse. If it's stimming or it just depends. But there are many students who really need to have some sort of occupational therapy or just opportunities to get some of the sensory input, whether they're older teenagers or often occupational therapy stops after elementary school and everyone is told it's not educationally relevant. And for people with autism, it's not only educationally relevant, it's essential right through adulthood. So a lot of people really need that. And that can help a lot of the behaviors, especially during the teenage years, if the teenagers are willing to participate in some of those things that will make them better. Thank you for emphasizing the need to be explicit. Autistic people have to work out the rules for interactions explicitly, built up over the years from painful, awkward social failures. NTs don't understand how much information they can process implicitly. You're absolutely right. And I keep hearing this, and I see it with my own son. That's why small talk is so disturbing. And yet we do it with students all the time because we have this need to attempt to establish rapport, and we do that through small talk. And so often students are coming in and we're saying, hi, how about that weather today? Isn't it beautiful? Yeah, but all the rain we've been having. And a lot of students with autism, we've already lost in the conversation because I hear it from students all the time. Why do people have to talk to me about the weather and their weekend? I don't want to hear about either of those things. But it feels rude when someone walks into your office to say, sit down, let's get to work. That just feels and sounds rude, but it's not about us. It's about meeting the needs of the person in front of you, and that may be their need. So I agree. You have to be very explicit And we also, day like today, where I have 60 minutes to get a lot of information dumped, I speak pretty quickly. When I'm meeting with a student, I slow down my pace, and not out of lack of respect, out of respect that the student may process at a different rate than I'm speaking, or may be distracted. So when I slow down to this, I would probably bore most of you, or you might feel frustrated if I talked at that rate for an hour. But when I'm working with students, that's absolutely what I do.
Do you have tips for how to support students with autism who are experiencing anxiety about graduating and leaving the familiar space of college?
We call it senior sabotage, and I've seen it way too often. So students often take a long time to get adjusted to college, but once they do, and they know where they live and how it smells and what the food is like and what they like to do during the day, then it's really hard to leave. And so doing it slowly, there's one college, actually, Western Kentucky University, that had a developer build an apartment building right at the edge of campus as a transition place for students. They have to pay rent, they get jobs, and they have help with that career jump. But it's incredibly helpful for students to be nearby some of those support people and be able to do some of the same things on campus. It's a nice model. I don't know that it's going anywhere else in the country, but I think that it's important to get students thinking about it early. On some campuses, just for autistic students, they do a career boot camp and do a lot on finances, and really it's sort of adulting 101, but giving people time to get into that, which absolutely, I appreciate that. I know it's an anonymous comment or question, but I really appreciate you bringing it up, because some colleges with specific autism programs are doing an amazing job of transitioning people out in the same way we transition people in. And we're trying to get more colleges to do just that, but it is very difficult. And I think you'll start seeing it at more colleges across the country as more and more students, are not just autistic students, are having similar issues, both with getting jobs, finding places to live, and just figuring out how they live when they're no longer a college student, or as one person put it, what you do when you open your door and your best friends aren't in the hallway. That it's a good way to think of it, and how you transition to that next step. It may take some of our neurodiverse students longer, and it may take that 5th year of college for them to start, or maybe living off campus that final year while taking 1 or 2 courses and working. Just doing those kinds of things slowly can really help support the change. But thank you for all you do for all your students, and especially for your students with autism. Thank you very much.